And just as a reminder, if you are just joining, that we don't have a normal research series event this Wednesday, and because of the Thanksgiving break, this is actually our last workshop event until November 29th. So we hope that you can take a very well-deserved break, that you eat a little bit too much and get to see some family and some friends and be safe and enjoy yourselves. Gustavo, thank you so much for moderating today. I'm happy to turn the reins over to you to kick us off.
Awesome. So, well, welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Dan Bernhardt from University of Illinois. He's a professor of economics and also finance, and I think that he's a professor also at University of Warwick. So he has like amazing publications and papers in so many interesting areas, including political economy, finance, industrial organization, and many other topics. So Dan, thank you very much for doing this. The floor is yours. I will keep the queue so people can ask questions directly. Raise your hand or put the question in the chat box, and then either Dan or I will read the questions. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I should say that this is joint work with Stefan Krasa and Meti Shadmer, with whom I have a long recurring research relationship. Let me just jump straight into it. Oops, let me not jump straight into it. There we go. God invited us all to eat and drink all we wanted. He smiled on our land, and we grew crops of plenty to eat and wear. God called, "Come to my feast." Rockefeller, Morgan, and their crowds stepped up and took enough for 120 million people and left only enough for 5 million of all the other 125 million to eat. And so many millions must go hungry and without those good things God gave us, unless we call on them to put some of it back. So that was Huey Long in the middle 1930s, right during the Great Depression. What was his plan? Well, he wanted to share the wealth. He wanted to impose a high progressive tax. He wanted to distribute the revenue to every American family, $5,000 each, supposedly enough for a home, a car, and a radio. The radio was important because he wanted them to hear his speeches. But that wasn't it. Each family would also be guaranteed an annual income of $2,500, plus shorter working weeks, better veterans benefits, education subsidies, pensions, and so on and so forth. It was what you would call the stuff of shoddy economic fantasy, but shining 24-karat political gold. Now, this was what was confronting Roosevelt in 1935. He understood, in the end, for those of you who don't know, Long was assassinated on the floor of the Senate. But FDR was worried about this threat of this populist, and he said he hopes to defeat the Democratic Party and put in a reactionary Republican that would bring the country to such a state that by 1940, Long thinks he would be made dictator. There are in fact some Southerners looking that way and some progressives drifting this way. It is an ominous situation. So what did FDR do? Well, he mimicked. He implemented his own wealth tax, the Soak the Rich Act, and he redistributed with the Social Security Act, so on and so forth. It wasn't that FDR thought that the wealth tax was good. In fact, he knew it wasn't good, that it was bad for the economy, but I am fighting communism, Huey Longism, Coughlinism, Townsendism. Father Coughlin and Townsend being populists, with anti-Semitic views that were popular in the 1930s. And, behind this and what's going to be the focus of our paper today, or the insights that we're going to try to capture in our model, is two phenomena that I think are very important, and one which every of all the founding fathers of the American Republic believed in, that they were concerned about short-sighted people and praying demagogues, and they instituted all sorts of protections against them. For example, the Senate was selected by, it was not voted by the people until many years later. And how did Madison view the concern about short-sighted people? Well, he thought that man by nature invariably chose short-term interests over long-term interests. And, and we had, people had to be protected against themselves. And why? Well, they were vulnerable to demagogues. And who were these demagogues? These were men of sinister designs who may, by intrigue, by corruption or other means, first obtain the suffrages and then betray the interests of the people. Okay, so what is it about demagogues? Well, they tell people what they want to hear, and the people can be tricked into focusing on small short-term gains at the expense of long-run costs. So this is especially true after hard times. If the Panic of 1819 and the subsequent recession brought on Jackson. Jackson in turn, destroyed the banking system significantly. De Tocqueville described him as commencing as a demagogue and ending as a tyrant. Then you had the later panics, which gave rise to Jennings Bryant, and the Depression, which gave rise to Huey Long, Coughlin, Olson and Townsend, and so on and so forth. And the point is that when you have the presence of demagogues and you have voters who are short-sighted, then you better, if you have responsible parties, then they better take care in the policies that they propose and adjust to the circumstances in the way that Roosevelt did, if they want to prevent the election of a demagogue. Okay, and that's what we're going to formalize in our analysis today and analyze. And so the feature that I want you to focus on and think about and reflect about is that populism is an inherently dynamic phenomena, in that you have this trade-off between current short-term payoffs but with long-term costs. Okay, if you look at the real world, you see demagogues of all types running capital down in all forms. So you can have demagogues on the left, like you would see in Venezuela and or Zimbabwe. You can have demagogues on the right in Nazi Germany, Putin's Russia, Poland, Hungary, Trumpian United States. And what do these demagogues all do? They run down capital. Sometimes, and you want to think of this multiple forms of capital. So I want you to think not just about providing simplistic solutions that ignore resource constraints in the form of, okay, let's cut taxes and increase spending. Let's raise budget imbalances, but I also want you to think about the damaging of legal institutions and property rights, which, I think is happening now in Putin's Russia. It's happening arguably with Xi in China. It also takes the form, you can interpret populism in which, the populists, try to divide ethnic groups. In the US, there's this, for lack of a better description, there's certainly, among Republicans, this pointing at these, ivory towered intellectuals or socialists and communists, tarring educated people, the establishment, and dividing, this anti-immigrant movement, the us and them, where they have to protect the people against the establishment. That form of protection, of dividing and reallocating, destroys the social fabric that binds society and contributes to a more productive future. It's saving down our human social capital, okay? And that's what I want you to think about and try to understand today. So what are we going to do in our analysis? I'm going to look at the dynamics of a political competition between two parties. One of these parties is an idealist party. It wants to do what's best for voters. And it's competing against a demagogue that doesn't have any principles that it cares about. All it cares about is wanting to hold office for whatever reason. And then we have, on the other side, these two parties are appealing to myopic, short-sighted voters who are, what they're going to do is they're going to care about two things. They're going to care about the current policy platforms. So they're going to look at the payoffs that they get from the platforms today. They're not going to think about the less tangible consequences for tomorrow of spending down spending down physical capital, of large budget constraints. So that's the negative side. On the other hand, they also care about other attributes, non-policy attributes of the parties, which is going to take the form of a stochastic valence advantage. And what do I mean by valence? Those could be things like integrity, honesty. It could be non-policy issues. So the benevolent party is going to be disadvantaged because it's going to want to save for the future, and voters don't appreciate that if you're going to save more for the future, that that means less for today. They don't understand that trade-off. But on the other hand, the voters are going to tend to like the benevolent party more. Okay. So we're going to ask, well, the questions that we pose and answer in this paper are, how does the political competition from the populist affect the policy choices of the benevolent party? When is the benevolent party more likely to lead the economy to grow despite political competition from a populist? And when should we be worried about demagogues? So, and in particular, when is it going to be the case that a long-run death spiral with ever-vanishing social capital become a possibility or an inevitability? So here, I want you to think of Venezuela, which, you know, at one point was the wealthiest country in South America, and it's, well, you can see it today. That is my poster, or if you want Zimbabwe, those are my poster child or children for long-run death spirals. So how do we model this competition between parties and how they appeal to voters over time? Well, there are going to be two parties, the benevolent party and the demagogue. They're going to compete. Just imagine the time progressing in an election. There's an election now, there's an election next year, election 2 years, so on and so forth. In each period, the economy is going to begin with a capital stock. And the problem that what parties are going to propose is how do they divide that output from the capital between investment in the future capital stock and current consumption for voters. And what parties are going to do is their platform is going to be how much to invest in the future. And that's going to determine, the residual is going to determine, you know, what saving or consumption is for today. And we're going to let parties spend down capital by a limited amount in order to raise consumption today. So how do I want you to think about spending down capital? You can think of it as cutting taxes that raise debt. If you're in Illinois, you know that there's unfunded pension liabilities. I think the government employees, their pension is 30% funded or something horrible like that. They can not invest in infrastructure. They can not address climate change. They can run down legal capital by expropriating resources from, you know, that's what Xi's doing to some extent now with some of the entrepreneurs in China, and it's what Putin did in Russia. So there's all sorts of ways of spending down capital. They're limited in how much they can cut capital, 10%, 20%, some limit. And then, so what's the competition? Well, it's going to be, the parties are going to propose investments. There's going to be an election, and then the winning party's policy is going to be implemented. And that's going to in turn determine the capital stock for the next period. And the economy is going to keep on going on like that forever. The policies, the policies that are being chosen by or proposed by the parties are going to be voted on by the voters. The voters are myopic. They care only about current consumption implied by the proposed investment policies. What is their utility from consumption today? And they're also going to care about candidate valence. You know, so the integrity, charisma, whether they're good public speakers, good joke tellers. I have a flat voice. I'd obviously be a low valence guy. And there's some uncertainty about these valences. And the voters are going to compare the composite payoff from each candidate. So the utility from their proposed investments, the consumption consequences, plus their valence, and they're going to pick the candidate that they like best. And the other key is the candidates face some uncertainty. They don't know how their valences are going to be perceived when they choose their investment policies. And on a technical point, the one technical point that I want you to take into account and retain is that the feature of current consumption that we care about, how people value current utility, is that when there's smaller capital, then reducing consumption by a fixed percent has a bigger negative impact on voter utility. Another way of saying it is when a voter is hungrier, then he cares relatively more about policy and relatively less about a candidate's other valence features. And what that's going to do is when you have hungry voters, it's going to make it harder for a benevolent party to sell austerity, to propose to invest and still win. Voters are relatively more attracted by policies that dissave now and give voters a bigger share of what's out there when the pie itself is smaller. That's the key feature that we're going to include. So what results do we prove? Well, we first prove that the demagogue only cares about winning. And so what he wants to do is he wants to design a policy that's going to maximally appeal to the myopic voters. Well, when you have myopic voters, they don't think about the future associated with future capital. And so they're going to disinvest as much as possible. They're going to they're going to propose to maximize current consumption for voters and forget about the future. Okay. Well, what happens when capital stocks are low? Well, when capital stocks are low in the middle of the Depression, think about Roosevelt's problem. There are hungry voters. The demagogues' policy advantage is higher when capital is lower. And so that means that the benevolent party must cut back on its investment and provide more consumption to voters in order to have a chance of winning now when it has high valence. If it, the hungrier voters care relatively less about the benevolent party's good features, its integrity, its honesty, its on average, and relatively more about consumption. And so what that means is that the benevolent party is going to have to save less and give more back to voters. It's going to have to reduce taxes. It's going to have to increase spending. And the lower is capital, the tougher times are, the more a benevolent party has to mimic the demagogue's disinvestment policy in order to have a chance of winning. That is a central message that you want to take, and it gives you an understanding for why in hard times demagogues thrive. The depressing message that we have is that in this economy where when the demagogue can win and dissave and drive down capital, well, then the benevolent party as capital stocks fall, then the benevolent party itself has to propose to dissave in order to have a chance of winning. What does that mean? Well, that means you'll get to a point where the capital stocks, if they ever go too low, then in order to have a chance of winning, the benevolent party itself is going to have to disinvest. Well, what does that mean when the benevolent party is disinvesting? That's going to mean that capital stocks are going to be shrinking at a faster and faster rate, and you're going to get a death spiral. It's going to shrink faster when the demagogue wins and when the benevolent party wins, but you're going to be in an environment where you're doomed. And it's also the case, you can see that there's always a chance of a death spiral. Why? Well, the demagogue always has a chance of winning. And if he wins, he's going to drive down capital. When capital falls, the benevolent party has to can invest less, and eventually and if the demagogue wins again and again, you're eventually going to drive capital down so that the benevolent party has to disinvest. It also gives you another insight. There's a sense in which you want to think that the US, is an established democracy. It's set up these, it has huge investments in the capital of social capital and democratic capital that, the well-established legal system. So it's more secure. In contrast, you have a young democracy like Eastern Europe, Hungary, Poland. Well, there, if you get, or South Africa, South Africa started out with Mandela, right? Russia didn't have Putin at the outset, but if younger democracies start out with lower levels of capital. So if you have a demagogue win like Putin, you're going to spend down your oil, revenues, you're going to spend, you're going to have pensions for people at age 50, you're going to drive down, you're going to expropriate property rights, drive down investment, and they're more vulnerable to a risk of a death spiral. Okay, so you want to think younger democracies, higher risk of really, really bad outcomes from which there's no recovery. So again, what are the key messages that we have? If capital stocks fall too low, you're doomed. It's always a chance that the demagogue can win a few times. If you get an attractive demagogue who keeps winning, he drives down capital, then you may enter a death spiral and it becomes inevitable. And there's also a sense in which there's a win-win feature for the demagogue of disinvesting. It maximizes the probability of winning in the current period because you have myopic voters, but it also helps in the future because it reduces the capital stock, which makes voters hungrier. But when voters are hungrier, then they are differentially more attracted to the demagogue's disinvestment policy. And so it helps the demagogue in the future as well. So that's the bad news side. There's also a good news side in that it's not necessarily the case that an economy, a democracy like the United States is inevitably going to fail. If we have good leaders at the outset, well, go back and think about the founding fathers. You had Washington, you had Madison, you had Jefferson. Well, they invested in the capital of democracy. The capital stocks rose, and when the capital stocks rise, then the benevolent party is facing less competition from the demagogue, and so he can invest more. And in fact, he will invest more than he would if he didn't face the demagogue, because he wants to ensure against the possibility of a demagogue winning and driving down capital. So the threat of a demagogue is going to cause the benevolent party to invest well, so a lot. So if you're lucky enough to have good leaders, high valence party leaders, then the economy is going to, the capital of democracy is going to be increased and outcomes are going to improve. And, you know, I highlight that we prove that, the threat of the demagogue has an impact such that, if you can invest and you're facing the risk of the demagogue winning and driving down capital, that risk matters more when you're closer to sort of a situation where the demagogue, where the threat of the demagogue, where voters are going to appreciate the demagogue's disinvestment policy more. I want to finish off by talking about what happens when capital stocks grow high. And I want to ask the question, is a death spiral inevitable? Well, the answer is going to be no, it's not. And the way I want you to think about it is think about a gambler's ruin problem. So Fermat had Fermat's last theorem posed a gambler's ruin problem originally, where there are two people with fixed pies. They flip a coin. If it's heads, I get $1 more. If it's tails, you get $1 more. And the question is, what is the likelihood with which I get bankrupted versus you get bankrupted when our when you have a bigger pot, you start out with more wealth than I. Well, our problem is a setting where the demagogue is effectively infinitely wealthy because he's always going to be there. The benevolent party, if capital stocks ever fall too low, then we enter a death spiral out of which capital stocks keep falling faster and faster and faster. And so in this case, the demagogue is never going to be bankrupted, but there's always a risk of the benevolent party being bankrupted. In other words, falling below the capital threshold where a death spiral starts. And the difference between a classical gambler's ruin problem and ours is, well, the benevolent party may be more likely to win because he's more attractive in terms of having higher valence typically, so he's viewed more favorably on the non-policy virtues. And then the steps that you win, are determined by the investments that the candidates make when they're in office. And what we can show is that, well, there's always a positive risk of a death spiral. But if the economy is sufficiently productive and the benevolent party is sufficiently likely to be high valence, so it's sufficiently likely to win, then there's a stochastic drift upward toward greater capital. And so the probability of a death spiral is bounded away from 1. There's always a risk of a death spiral because the demagogues can always win enough times in a row to drive down capital, but it's not inevitable. And in particular, if you get good draws at the outset of leaders, you can build up enough social and institutional capital to offset rare draws of a bad demagogue. Whereas, if you look at South Africa or maybe Venezuela, a few demagogues near the outset might doom the democracy forever. So let me just stop here. I want you to take home a few messages. When you have the costs of populists are dynamic. They spend and destroy capital to appeal to short-sighted voters. Populists are differentially more attractive in bad times. So that's going to bring out more populist policies, even by responsible parties. There's a risk of just democracy collapsing if capital stocks ever fall too low. But death spirals are not inevitable. If you get good leaders that grow capital by enough early on, then you can stand off the occasional draw of a demagogue. And let me stop here and hit escape and turn it over possibly. Oops. Let me not turn it over that. Let me go back here.
Okay, so that's good. So I can start collecting some questions for you, Dan. So I see that Dean and Brian raise their hands. So I didn't get the order. So I don't know who wants to go first. So Dean, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll go ahead.
I got it first in my screen, but I don't know if you were the first raising your hand.
Yeah.
And then Brian, and then I see Tonya in that order.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I'm trying, as an empirical guy, I'm trying to operationalize your model here, which seems really stylized. You've got a benevolent party and then a demagogue party. And when I look out there, I see politicians, I see almost all of them having some demagogic components. I think you can argue that, pick a topic, say climate, Republicans, Democrats, both demagogue the issue a bit, pick immigration. And so you're setting up a world that I'm just not sure how applicable it is. And it's devoid of interest groups and other constraints. So I'm trying to figure out how you test your hypotheses, what you might do to modify the model, how it would, there's a lot of questions here, of course.
Okay.
How does it link into the median voter and so on? Maybe give us some empirical context.
Okay, so yeah, so let me give you, so one of the things that you can, so there are two sorts of issues. One is that we do have this strong empirical prediction that hard times bring about relatively more populist policies. Secondly, if you were to as this first point that I have here, think about who's going to support the populace, who's going to be differentially supportive of populists. Well, the elites who are getting a bigger share of the economic pie, if you think about it, they care relatively more than, they're less hungry because they're getting more. So, and so if you think about the division of voting, the elites are going to care relatively more about valence than the common person. So in that, so if you want to interpret elites as being more educated, more wealthy, you're going to get the result that the poor, it's going to be, for example, the rural white poor who are going to differentially support demagogues. And if you were to look out there at the, in Eastern Europe, in Hungary and Poland, you clearly see this. You see the cities, which have a much more educated population, they are the ones who are, not who are not voting against, who are not supporting the demagogue. So you get this cross-sectional predictions about who's going to support a demagogue. And you also get the time series patterns.
Let me interrupt for a second. I don't know how if you have a prediction like that you want to implement, you have to be able to define who's a demagogue or not. I don't see how you do that. maybe you can define them yourself, but
yeah,
good luck
so,
today.
I mean, again, the us versus them message, the division, you can boil it. I have a model, so yeah, so I would argue that I know it when I see it. And it's hard as a matter, it's hard as a matter of course to quantify policy, but you can see, for example, greater spending down, greater budget deficits. You can see seizing of property rights. Those are populist actions. You can see playing around with democratic norms with regard to the guardrails of democracy. Yeah, so it's one thing to see it, then I can and I think it's not so hard to see. It's maybe harder to quantify, which is what you're asking. Let me stop there.
Okay, so Brian,
Okay, good. I think I maybe share some of the concerns and issues that Dean was talking about in terms of possibly modifying the model. And I could say a lot about a lot of things, including the kind of rhetorical structure. But for this, I'll try and engage constructively in terms of what might be done with this model. And so kind of two major comment questions. One, de Tocqueville talked about, self-interest rightly understood. What happens if people do have a longer term perception of their interest, and in terms of the model, whether there would be ways to modify this model and see what happens with your median voter, rather than, I'm sorry, something that seems like it's set up to get the results you did in terms of its internal logic. But you could explore either different median voter or different political structure related to coalitions and so on. And secondly, I spent a bunch of time living and working in Thailand. And so it's given me a little bit perspective on something that certainly could be fit into a demagogue model. And certainly the old guard elite would love to do that, but can also be seen as a contest between new money and old money. And old money thinks they're entitled to keep all these huge windfall rents that have appeared in the economy. And the demagogue had a program which actually had some things that arguably might have been better investments. And so again, that seems to be something that could be done in terms of possibly ways of exploring a broader set of conditions for this model. So thank you.
Okay, so I would say so I tried to keep the presentation relatively general. There is in effect a median voter in our economy, so
It's debatable.
yeah, no, I mean, so I have so the median so it's not an ideological dimension, it's a share of the economic pie dimension. So you can it's divide. We don't have an ideology because I think, among other things, you see demagogues on the left and the right, but you have those who get more and those who get less, and that's going to and the ones who get relatively more, they care, they care relatively more about valence and relatively less about policy. And so they're going to differentially support the benevolent party. The other thing that I think is really important, so as point 3 here, voter learning. So I think that in practice, voters do learn about the consequences of disinvesting. Tangibility matters. So one of the things, if you were to look at, it's hard to understand the consequences of growing debt until it bites. So Greece learned one day very rapidly that having pensions where people retire at age 50 that are quite and sustaining it with higher and higher debt. Well, at some point it becomes unsustainable and it bites and it hits home. To give a personal example, I was at Queen's University in the 1990s, and we had one of the best departments in the world, top 20 department. And then the budget bit, and the premier of the day, Bob Ray, introduced Ray Days. He gave us unpaid days of vacation, quote unquote. But we could take these unpaid days on any day that we wanted, except for those where we were teaching. So it's just a way of cutting everybody's salary by 10%. And I do think that voters do learn about the consequences of disinvesting, because that things that weren't tangible somehow become tangible. And I think that trying to understand how candidates compete when there's this tangibility, political scientists don't have models of tangibility. They assume that when voters are out there that they understand the policies of, they understand perfectly the platforms of voters, but that abstraction is ridiculous. And it has lots of implications. Nobody understood the difference between Obama's health platform and Hillary's platform. Nobody even really understands what the consequences of debts are. I know that a higher debt is somehow a bad thing. Somehow it's a bad thing. If you can tell me how bad it is or how not bad it is, I'll be impressed. So we just, I do think that, we are abstracting from that phenomena, and it, and so maybe the right way to think about it is to have voters, who don't learn about the costs until they're substantially, until they become literally tangible.
Okay, to leave time for others, I'll just make quick follow-up. Again, the model could be extended with demagogues who are more like stationary bandits rather than just opportunists for the next election. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, so Brian, I understand that that's essentially was your question in the chat. So I will move to Tonya and Jamie. Then we can discuss that third question by Brian later, I think.
Yeah.
Please, Tonya, thanks for the question.
Hi. First off, I want to say thanks for this presentation. This is something that I actually have recently developed an interest in, since I taught a class on elections over the summer and had a whole lecture on demagogues, and my students love this topic. So it's all super interesting. I guess I had some similar concerns to the things that Dean and Brian raised. So, one concerning how you define a demagogue, because, right, they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Even outside of like their policy appeals, they use all sorts of different kinds of tactics to try and mobilize voters and gain support. So there's, appeals to the people, blaming other parties for things. Like there's just so many things that like kind of go into the demagogues toolkit of how they mobilize support, that I think could be maybe a little bit further considered in modeling. And then another thing I wanted to comment on was just kind of like the boundary of, in that light, the boundary in cases of types of demagogues that you're looking at, and you know how you're thinking about a demagogue, because I don't know if we necessarily always know when we see it, at least not right away, right? Sometimes, you know, parties can mobilize the electorate, and they're using some kind of, and you know, every party uses some sort of demagogue-like language. So like, where's the threshold of where we start defining parties as populist and demagogues? So I guess just thinking a little, I would say thinking a little more critically about that. And also, the second point that I guess kind of gets at what Dean and Brian were talking about too is kind of this like, I guess this assumption of kind of what goes into voter considerations and the general assumption of voter myopia. And I get that voters learn over time, right? But I mean, particularly, and I'm trying to think too, this is in light of, or in line with, you know, the comment of like thinking through more like kind of empirical cases that you're thinking like reflect this. Because, you know, I think about situations and countries in Africa, and you use Zimbabwe as an illustrative case, but I mean, the voter going to the polls in an election in Zimbabwe or other places in Africa is going to have a whole different set of additional considerations beyond just their current economic situation, and you know, valence appeals. Like I mean, there's you know, several instances of political violence that's particularly pervasive in elections. There are these dynamics of clientelism and vote buying. And you know, can a populist party, like I would argue maybe a populist party couldn't even be very successful in those kinds of environments, where you have extensive clientelist networks and you have this incumbent catch-all party that can just keep mobilizing voters who are in economic destitute, that are able to, you know, get some money for giving their vote to somebody. So I just think this, in light of that, maybe like the scope of cases that this is applicable to should be like a little more narrowly defined, because I don't know that the predictions could be applicable to any situation, and maybe only a very finite number of situations. So.
Okay. So in my model, and you know, I have a setting where the demagogue is defined by the feature that he only cares about winning. So, you know, obviously that's, you know, that's an abstraction. But, you know, again, if you're trying to model, you need to, what you're trying to do in any model is you're trying to get, you know, you're making simplifications to get at the essence. And so, you know, the form of clientelism that you're describing, I would describe that as, you know, perfectly consistent with voters pursuing short-term interests at, you know, at long-term costs. The us versus them-ism that you described, you know, and the expropriation of property rights, that's a form of destruction of capital that I think you know, that my model is meant to capture. You know, that my model is a simplification. You know, given that you have people on the left and the right, the defining feature of who are populists or demagogues, the defining feature of a demagogue is not ideology. It's that he wants to win. And, an outcome of wanting to win, when you have short-sighted voters, they don't have to be fully myopic. They can be short-sighted, is that you're going to try to appeal to their short-term interests. Now, I also agree with you that, the demagogue, to the extent that the demagogue plays with the rules of the game, that he gerrymanders, or that, which is what for example, you see in Hungary, or Turkey, that just magnifies the threat of the demagogues. You can also view that as well as a form of destroying of, I think, of democratic capital. So it's just how you want to interpret. I think when you have a model, it's you write down something that's capital, okay, and then you have a median voter where you're not distinguishing by ideology, or you're distinguishing by the share that they get of that capital, those who get bigger shares versus lesser shares. Now you can have clientelism, us versus them type divisions. Again, I think when those transpire to destroying of property rights, the taking of of property, well, that in my economy, it's the government that's reducing its investment, but you also, the consequences of taking property is that individuals reduce investment. And I want to interpret all of that in the same way. You have to make that abstraction to have a characterization that you want. I completely agree with you as well that there are lots of there are many features of of populists, and and we're isolating some of them. There are others that are important. I think that the the defend the people matters. It's I'm representing the people. I want to take that spin to spin that interpretation in my context, in terms of settings where that's takes the form of spending down capital of society. So I want to interpret a lot of what you're saying within my model.
Okay, so I think we're running out of time, but Jamie, can you ask your question? Sorry that and then I think Dan, you can answer to Jamie's question, and then take maybe one or 2 minutes to wrap up. If people want to stay to talk more with you, I think they're welcome. Hopefully, Dan, you have some extra minutes.
Yeah.
I see some extra comments in the chat, so I think it's going to be interesting. Jamie, please. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Gustavo. I'll be brief. I just want to echo some of the earlier comments that I think it's challenging right now to understand like what you're trying to test and what you're arguing for. I think because you're wanting to simplify the model, but I think you're dealing with something very complex. So don't shy away from that complexity. I mean, the Ostrom workshop, the Ostroms, as you know, were advocates for acknowledging the complexity and the fact that all people involved in the political process have something at stake. So just embrace that and go with that. So part of that drives me to this first question. But yeah, so comments like, I know it when I see it. Please don't say that in an academic setting again, because we know like that is not, that just, yeah, there are things that are hard to define, but we're really supposed to try and prove our assumptions. And that's something that Vincent and Ellen are sort of.
So I'm going to disagree with you there. Okay, quite strongly. You're not supposed to prove assumptions. You start out with assumptions and you derive results.
You're supposed to examine your assumptions.
and how do you examine the assumptions? I'll tell you how you examine the assumptions. You know,
Well, Dan, just remember, this is an interdisciplinary group coming from lots of different backgrounds. So not all of these disciplines are using assumptions in the same way. So it's just important to be mindful of that.
yeah, okay, sorry.
I apologize.
Oh, it's okay. No,
I'm
it's okay.
sorry.
It's
I
okay.
wasn't
No,
trying to
it's
be
a
unchargeable.
legitimate point. And again, this
Okay.
is both the challenge, you know, and the opportunity of these types of gatherings and convenings. We're all coming at these same topics from different perspectives, and hopefully we can be useful in that convening. But I know it's a challenge. But I really enjoyed the discussion, so I didn't mean to cut it off.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
no, it's perfectly appropriate for you to do that.
Oh, I was wondering about the idea of accounting for federalism, because, you know, I know you mentioned Trump as an example a few times. And what I think is fascinating about what made the Trump presidency possible is what happened during the primaries. Because I think about when he did pull ahead in the primaries was when John Kasich decided to stay in the race, even though he knew he was going to lose. And it was because he had because he didn't want to see, I think, Cruz win. And so that's really what tipped the balance of the Republican primary and allowed Trump to pull ahead. So we forget that there's other players involved besides just presidents and voters. Like there are politicians according to self-interest at all stages of the political process. So there's a lot of federalism happening. And I think another question, so that's my first question. How do you account for federalism? I think that'd be so fascinating to deal with in your work. And my second question is, what do we do with demagogues who pose as idealists? Because I think you mentioned Greece and the challenges of debt in relation to Greece paying pensions to 50-year-olds. And I think we see certain parties in the US advocating for that as well. But sometimes that happens in the context of idealism. So that's a really interesting tension too, that I would love to see you explore.
Oh, so, yeah, so federalism, I don't know how to think of. I think actually Kasich, I think that what happened, my understanding of Trump was, you know, all the standard candidates thought that he was going to lose for sure. And so they wanted to be kind to him. And what caused him to win was he had this small niche of strong support. And so he's winning a lot of these pluralities versus the the establishment divided. I think that may be what you were referring to. And I completely agree with that. That would be my interpretation of how he happened to do it. I would say that, you know, in terms of the machinery that you have to analyze these problems, when it's a dynamic setting, you know, you're basically at the limits of what's technically feasible to do in the framework that we're at. That, you know, you can go to frameworks where there are 2 periods and you sort of say, well, tomorrow is sort of capturing, you know, a today, tomorrow, and we sort of look at how tomorrow, you know, that's capturing the whole future. But that misses a lot of things. Then you can't look at things like, what are the dynamics of capital? How can we get a Zimbabwe? How can we get a Venezuela? And go back to your, so federalism, I just don't know how to address, because federalism, I don't know how to address. Oh, you were talking something about changing the rules of the game, I think. But go back and say the question again.
I think, oh boy, I was talking about the idea of changing the rules. I didn't use that term, but you were spot on to recognize that. Okay, I'm trying to remember the context. Was it about how Kasich decided to stay in the race whenever, because of personal animosity towards other primary candidates in the primary? Is that?
Yeah. Demagogues posing as idealists. Oh, yes, it was posing as idealist. So I would have,
Being idealist.
so I think that in practice, sometimes demagogues start out as idealists and then they just care about winning, that they evolve. Yeah, you know, so so I think Erdogan might be an example of that, if I could call. I think, you know, it's yeah, you know, then you have a problem where somebody comes in office and he wants to, he wins, so he's there, and now he does stuff that is, you know, now he behaves like a demagogue. That's not in my model. You know, it would matter. Yeah, you know, he becomes a demagogue, and so therefore, you know, you want to then interpret him down the road as a demagogue, and it would start describing it, you know, and so plausibly that's in Hungary, you know, that's, I think you've had in a lot of these countries as well, some of the divide among the establishment parties, you know, so, you know, in Russia, for example, you know, you had a lot of establishment parties, and you've had this effort now to combat the demagogue by the establishment parties, by the, you know, they pick a favored candidate. You know, so I think, you know, some of that's changing the rules of the game by the demagogue to advance himself, and it's competition by the establishment parties who do want to do what's best for voters, even though they disagree with that. And, you know, you could interpret in our framework having more than two establishment parties. So now you run into the limitations of our model. Our model is a one-dimensional. We don't have any ideology. But now, if you want to bring in additional ideology, that's going to parse voters up, and so that in different ways, and it's going to, you know, it's going to complicate how you can't solve it. You know, in the same way that, you know, if we look at political competition, once you go past one dimension, you typically can't solve it even in an ideological space. And so, you know, this is sort of the limits of formal models. But that said, you know, I do think that the dividing up of voters into pieces, you know, and the response of the, you know, to a demagogue by these parties that, you know, that want to stop the demagogue, you know, that they coordinate on a favored candidate, that we've seen a lot in the last 2 years. They're behaving like the benevolent party that I have in my model here, in some sense, facing the constraints that are imposed by the gerrymandering, the rigging of the elections, so on and so forth, by the demagogues. Yeah, I think I can say something there, but quote unquote.
Okay, so we are super way past our 1 p.m. Limit, but I know, I guess that people are still there. They want to stay and keep discussing with you, Dan. So I will just open up things for a more kind of informal discussion if you want.
Yeah.
I see that there are some comments